Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Friends, where we discuss various topics. Today, we will be joined by Kristen, who has graciously come back for the third time to continue telling us a little bit more about trauma. Uh, just so you're aware, this live stream may discuss trauma of all sorts to include all types of abuse. Viewers and listeners may find it unsettling and triggering. If this live stream causes you distress, please seek support from your trusted folks and qualified mental health professionals as needed. You may also cease listening until you're able to listen again. Just remember that the guests on our lives reflect a diverse set of values, morals, and ethics that may not reflect the morals, values, and ethics of the Misfit Amish. And with that being said, I'd like to welcome Kristen back. Hi, how you doing?
I am doing well. I'm really excited to be back. And for anybody who was trying to follow the second episode, I know the audio was crazy. Please speak up in the comments if you're like, wait a minute, no, I want to make it better for you. So I apologize for that. Also, if you hang in there with that episode, I know it's annoying at first, it does get better. So there's that. Um, I'm going to dive right in, but I will first give kind of a recap because I know it's been a hot minute. I had to rewatch just so I could remember what we were talking about, where we left off. But I'm going to give just a brief definition of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder or injury, what and why there's a difference, and why I use a difference in terms, and in particular, complex trauma. So trauma, in a nutshell, is basically an event or events that happen outside of one's control. A lot of trauma is what we call relational, meaning it happens in the context of a relationship or relationships, and it can be of any kind. It can be systemic, like a relationship with one's church, or it can be a relationship, with a parents, significant other, whatever the case may be. It may also happen in with many different relationships. And what we know about trauma is that if you were likely to have had a bad or traumatic experience with a human, you are more susceptible to be re-experience another trauma with another human or human beings, simply because the symptoms are so impactful and changes, and I'll get into that in a minute, but changes the way your brain functions and the way you see the world, yourself, and protect yourself, that you're very likely to be in a risky situation again. Um, so, again, let's go back to that. What does that do to your brain? Well, some of y'all know we have different parts of the brain that do different things. Um, I'm being very brief about this. You guys can look this up. Vanderfolk does some really good, that's the body keep the score, does some really good kind of quick images. Sometimes doing a Google search will come up with so many diagrams. I was trained in trauma informed care by the Trauma Institute of California in Santa Cruz. They have a really good website with lots of information. But I like that this is a lot more easily findable. So I'm giving you a brief little bit of this. If you want to deep dive into it, I say have at it. But basically, trauma is that event or events that are too much, too big for our brain to process. And again, our brain has, this frontal lobe part where it's really about empathy, slowing down. I listened to a neurologist talk about how it's a lot more of the brake. That's where, like if it was a car or a piece of machinery, tractor, like it's like the brakes, right? It's slowing down, or a bridle on a horse, it's like, so right, slowing down, right? But the go mechanisms are back here, and that's also where we commonly know of our fight flight. It's also fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. Those are the ways Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Are you familiar with Dr. Janine Fisher?
Yes.
Okay, so then you know that she talks about also shame
Mm.
as a
Yeah.
trauma response. And I think for
Hmm.
our audience, it's kind of important for people to
Yeah.
understand what the shame impact can be
Hmm. Yeah.
for.
And I think the shame, when I look at that, the shame response can be kind of entwined in some of the other ones, like fawning. Like when we on somebody, we kind of do like lovey eyes or get very meek. Um, like women in particular, you get very meek and a fawning sort of way. And it's because of our shame. Like I am supposed to be smaller and submissive, and I am, or if I've done something, or this has um if my trauma, even, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but this is the way sometimes people respond. It leads to family shame. Like if a CSA or assault happens on a woman, and then it's sort of like, oh, I'm supposed to be very small and meek because I am ashamed that this happened to me, right? I allowed this, I brought this on myself, right? Does that, like,
Well, you know,
they're
if
all in.
you're indoctrinated and you're taught that
Mhm.
to be holy is to be shamed,
Mhm.
and even I'm thinking specifically, like one of the things that's often preached from the pulpit, at which we Amish had a non-existent pulpit because we didn't have a pulpit. But one of the things that was often preached is you have to teach children, du musst die Kinder lernen für sich schämen, which is like you have to teach children to be ashamed. Like
Mhm.
that was preached. It was
You know the
considered a virtue.
expression, cover your shame? Your body is your shame. Cover your shame, right?
And
What
then
does that tell us?
like the ideology around this, which is like,
Mhm.
okay, so you may believe. So sometimes trauma tells us things that are a little something. Like this one, for example, you may believe because of what you were taught
Mhm.
that you you what not only what happened to you is shameful, but also that you brought it upon yourself because you did not comply with the church rules. Like there's people who have actually talked about believing that because they didn't follow the church rules 100%, like it was their fault. It was their fault
Mhm.
if their dress was like a quarter of an inch too short, or their apron string was like a little too narrow or a little too wide. Like it's just like the arbitrary rules
This is
that
a
people use to justify
Yeah.
shaming people for being victims of crimes
This is a
of a
common one
sexual nature.
too, where your faith is supposed to be protective. And
Mm-hmm.
when something bad happens to you, that is an evidence of your lack of faith. And
Uh-huh.
so when you are a victim of a crime, you are then seen as a, more of an apostate, right? You've done something that says, I clearly didn't have faith, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's all. That part
And
of
I
the
did have
brain.
one more thing.
Sure, go for it.
You said anything that's too much, and I'm sorry. What if something is too fast?
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Yeah.
also included there? Okay. I
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to
I would
clarify
put
that.
that in the too much. It's basically, let me explain what too much is. Maybe that'll help. It's like, what can my nervous system handle? And I literally mean nervous system. Our stellate ganglion nerves right here are attached to that brainstem throughout our body. They're the ones that have a physical, this isn't, I know we're talking about mental health, but mental health sometimes gets put in a category that is outside of health. And I am like, nope, got to bring that together, because what happens to the brain in trauma is a biological injury, right? Our brains are trying to stay alive. If you think about the evolution, whatever you think of, the survival of humans over a long period of time, we are built to try to live. All creatures, right? You see the dogs in a wolf pack trying to keep itself safe, right? The lizards that try to have defense mechanisms that keep them from being eaten, right? We all creatures have some survival things built into them. This is our survival bit built into us. And it makes sense. It keeps us safe. These nerves, by the way, they don't just light up with trauma. Anything can be like a fear response, right? If I get startled, right? All of us experience being startled, right? Somebody like walks into the room really quick. That's our biology just keeping us safe, because we don't know, right? Is it going to be a dangerous situation? However, there's a point where our brain goes, oh my goodness, that was too much, right? And it can be things like too fast, right? Whoa, I didn't see that. The expression, the pulling the rug out from under me, right? I didn't have time to get my bearings. I didn't have time to process what was happening. It can be a lot, right? So the amount of things coming at you, the situation, it could also be over a long period of time too. So when I talk about complex trauma, what we're usually talking about is sort of layers and layers of trauma, and it usually is happening over a very long period of time. So when you talk to folks, like earlier in my story, I'm talking about childhood trauma from the early age of a baby, right? And I would even argue in my mother's womb as she's being abused, right, is like trauma from my conception, right? And so, and now I sit here, a 40-year-old woman, and the traumas that I had in adulthood, right? The things that layer on top of it. And I said before, when you have been a victim to trauma, you are biologically wounded in a way that makes you more susceptible to trauma again. So complex PTSD is a very important distinction. And it's interesting because I can't tell you how many times I've interacted with other professionals, health professionals, who have said, oh, I don't know what complex PTSD is. A lot of folks have heard what post-traumatic stress disorder is, right? That's the diagnosis from here. From
PTSD. Yeah,
right?
from the DSM-5.
Yeah, and that's the manual that gets determined what actually is a diagnosis. Although I will say this, that if it isn't in there, or it is in there, it doesn't always make it 100%. I don't know, the background that I came from wants to call it's not gospel, right? Right. This isn't necessarily the end all be all truth. And I'll explain that in a minute. Folks are doing the best they can with what they know in medicine and science over, it's usually like a 10-year period. They come out with a revised version, things like that. They get all together, they debate it. Nobody usually is 100% happy, by the way, because that's what compromise is. And things like that come up. Yeah.
You mean people have to compromise in the DSM?
Yeah. You know what?
Which is also why we don't have religious trauma syndrome in there.
Correct. And you know what? I want to say this too. My background in research and training tells me I need to look very carefully about who is invited to the conversation and who are they looking at and what questions are they asking, and what's happening. And so there's huge, I could go on and on with changes throughout time, and people have written papers and books on the subject about what's what, right? But anyway, what I look at is what do we know about trauma? Yes, there's stuff in the DSM, but a lot of folks have, and they may not be the technical diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they may have things like complex PTSD, even though that doesn't appear as a like codable thing.
No, it's not.
It's not a code.
But you know what is a codable thing?
Mary knows.
Chronic PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
They changed the ICD-10-CM to include chronic PTSD. So we now have chronic PTSD.
You know what I find interesting too is they talk about trauma being in remission. A lot of these diagnoses, I can talk about like things being in remission, and sometimes that's true. But let me tell you this: you can cope better. I don't want to, I want to be careful how I say this, because I never want to lead people, especially people who are impacted by trauma, to think that there isn't hope. It's really, there's a lot of hope. However, I want people to understand that once you have impacted and injured a brain with trauma, you have that injury until you do something biologically to affect that, right? Now, coping looks like surviving and thriving in lots of different ways, but it's not gone away, and it creeps its head up a lot of times very unexpectedly for people. I will be making more content to talk about the injury aspects of trauma, but I want people to know very just briefly that when things happen to people, it also doesn't matter what it is. Your brain doesn't make distinctions about, oh, somebody else had this worse, or that's not as bad as whatever. A huge part of my job when I sit with people on trauma recovery is first getting over. I had a client not long ago talk about feeling like it's imposter syndrome. Like my abuse wasn't as bad, right? This was just a whatever, it wasn't the most, or it wasn't the longest violent relationship that a woman has had. I don't know that I get to claim trauma. And the reality is, your trauma does not care about how you feel about it. The trauma claims you. It's not the other way.
Not only that, if you don't process it and find ways to manage it that are acceptable to you, it will come creeping up on you in ways you do not want it to.
Yes. And a lot of times what we see in mental health, and this happens a lot for folks that are undiagnosed with trauma symptoms or disorders related to trauma. And it's because they're going, I'm not traumatized. I don't like, they don't even process that as
what trauma? I'm fine. Everything is great. I'm not in denial. What is denial?
I can't tell you how many family members of mine, not all that I like hang with. I have a lot of it's interesting. I have a lot of family, but very, very few family that I have a relationship with because it is unsafe, right? And I don't mean that judgmentally. I mean, it is not physically or emotionally safe for me to be interacting and having a relationship with all of these folks. And a good portion of my family in some way or another goes, this was normal. It was fine what happened. And I've had family members say to one another, like actually to their face, about, you're going to complain about that you think is normal. Why are you being so terrible to our parents or to whoever, did that, like that, right? That shame comes in, right? And I know we've talked about this before, Mary, where it's this sort of, why don't you have empathy for your mother, your father, your whoever? They were doing the best they could. They did, like there isn't a recognition of the harm that person had in that space, in that place, in that relationship, right? And
there's no, because, and to me, the way that I think about that is when you have no recognition of the harm that was caused, one, you don't even understand what you're trying to address because you don't understand or grasp or comprehend what harm was caused and what potential for violence there is in the future. You don't understand that because you refuse to hear us when we tell you what it is. And then you are, in fact, since you care so much about the people who perpetrated crimes of a violent nature towards us or even of a sexual nature towards us. Since you care so much about that, you might be interested to know that in order for rehabilitation to be effective for abusive people, people actually have to go to school to learn how to do that. And the tactic is not to minimize the harm that they caused. Thank you very much.
I mean, it's logical, right? What I laugh because my husband grew up with parents who grew all sorts of food, and they were just amazing. The best tomatoes in the world came from my father-in-law's little plots. And but my husband has no skills whatsoever at growing anything. I tease him. I'm like, where were you when this was happening, right?
Look, we don't ask.
He goes, I was inside on a computer, and I was like, all right, that tracks. But I wouldn't put him in a field and say, make things grow. Like, you have to have an understanding, and you need an education to make that happen, right? You can apply that to almost anything, right? So if you're going to put someone in a role to say, how do I make this situation better? How do I make sure violence doesn't reoccur? How, and most importantly, how do I protect people who are vulnerable, right? Even if you don't, from the starting point, agree or understand where it comes from, maybe you're like, this is why I think this happened, and you very much disagree with me, I would say that's fine. We should agree on the premise that you should go learn about that, right? And I think it also takes this, and this speaks to what humans are capable of, their capacity to learn. And I've been very much understanding lately my own story, but I see it professionally a lot, where trauma meets a huge roadblock, and that is people's capacity. And a big capacity issue is a lot of the personality disorder world. I know right now it's very popular to talk about narcissists. I mean, you can think about our political culture and what's going on with narcissism, but this is a real thing. This is a very impacted person who cannot see themselves as responsible. And they also, and a lot of personality disorders, not just narcissism, but there's this capacity difficulty to see themselves as responsible for anything, but also there is a very deep void in who they are. They need love and validation, but not the kind you and I might need, where we go, oh, that's nice, and we feel it and we keep it and it does something for us. Imagine somebody who's got that need to be, like when we talk about egos, right, have that filled, but it's a void. It'll never be filled. You will always be wrong. You will always be needing to tend to them, to butter them up, to flatter them up. And what I've been noticing about folks who are like this is there are systems we have in place where people with personality disorders, particularly narcissism, are grown. It's like the perfect breeding ground to support that, and when I think about, for example, patriarchy, and like a man, for example, being in charge of others, and just starting at the premise that your gender makes you better, more powerful, more thought capable, and needing to protect other people because they're weaker. I mean, you're starting at a level that says, I already think you're special. That's dangerous. We know that grows. It either makes other men uncomfortable, and they're not going to stick around or fit in very well, or it's going to create men going, well, I'm going to do the best I can with that, but they're still playing by the rules. And what it really does is it grows narcissism, and that the narcissism that's already there is fostered and given power. And so that's the system that we all get to operate under. It happens many times in medicine, right? In different areas of research and positions of government, education, religion. I mean, you can look at lots of different ways where that shows up. And so we need to really be careful about who is showing up and what systems are creating, like, what are we, like, how are we putting, what fertilizer are we using that keeps growing these kinds of folks? Does that make sense? That environment matters. So that's the thing I've been seeing a lot professionally, is where it's not just the trauma, but it's how the folks that have the trauma, in fact, with impact and interact with other folks. So anyway, it is a brain injury. Your brain doesn't care about how you feel about the trauma. It doesn't care about, in comparison to anyone else, your brain is your brain. It doesn't know to compare it to anything else, right? And everybody's body is different. We also know too, I've been really educating myself in, and this is where I really want to encourage anybody who works in health, mental health, to continue, and we're supposed to, by law, we're supposed to be continuously educating ourselves. How seriously one takes that is an individual thing, but I really do want to encourage people to keep educating yourself. And one of the ways I've been doing this lately is around neurodivergence. Excuse me. Neurodivergence and trauma impacts. And so, I mean, autism, ADHD, these are all areas where someone's perception of the world themselves, how they process, is in a different way than other folks. And there are certain characteristics and things that happen that make these folks more susceptible to trauma, and also how they process the trauma. Big one is being people pleasing and not understanding that somebody was wrong to you, that you didn't do something wrong. And so I have been, the areas that I work in and the clients that I see, I have these like little groups of people. I always see things in like sort of the Venn diagrams, or like the kaleidoscope things where all the little pieces connect. So I see connections a lot. So the little areas of folks that I tend to work with a lot with my specialties are the LGBTQIA population and trauma, right? And so a lot of times I see people who are, because there's overlap in a lot of neurodivergence, gender and queerness, and a lot of trauma. Those folks sometimes don't know that those things are related for each other. I can't tell you how many times I've seen an adult who's been undiagnosed with ADHD or autism, and it's been like, oh, this is so helpful. I didn't know I was masking and struggling in my life. I thought it was me, right? And it's validating. And then when they understand that in the context of their trauma, to say, I understand now the way my brain works, and how this was a way that I was taken advantage of, and this is a way that hurted me when and now that I know this about myself. There's a really good interview, if anyone wanted to check it out, not that long ago on Mormon Stories podcast, of a man who came out of Mormonism, but he, as an adult, was diagnosed with ADHD and autism. And it's really informative if you ever kind of want to hear about how that experience is shaped their religion with their religious experience and their trauma experience with neurodivergence. So I highly recommend that. You very well spoken.
That's very fair. But I think there's also a portion of like being neurodivergent and being queer and experiencing trauma. People who are abusive are manipulative. They manipulate everybody around them. They also target, they they choose their victims very carefully. It is not your
Mm-hmm.
fault just because you
Yes.
are queer and you are more likely to be targeted for abuse, or just because you're a neurodivergent and you're more likely to be targeted for abuse. Like, that does not make it your fault.
No, no.
It is
And I
never
think,
your fault. And I want to be very clear about that.
yes. And I want to also explain too why this is important in therapy is to understand, when you understand how your brain works, you can also understand when something isn't my fault, right? I saw it
Uh-huh.
this way and I wasn't wrong to see it that way. Somebody was wrong to do that to me. And it also, that interview that I was talking about, he really talked about what was helpful for him was to
Mm-hmm.
understand, these are things I tend to look at people with, they have the best of intentions. And that hasn't always been the case. And maybe these are the ways that I keep myself safe, right? Because it, and I think that's even a lovely quality. It can be
Well,
taken advantage of and it's wrong, but it's
we're
it's like
often
what do I need to
indoctrinated.
do? Hmm?
People in high control groups are often indoctrinated to believe
Mm-hmm.
that, we should walk around believing everybody has the best of intentions. We should paint red flags green. And, when you've been taught something like that, people often talk about how trauma causes trust issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I often hear discussions about how there's a lack of trust.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the reverse that's true as well, because it can also impact your ability to be way too trusting.
Yeah.
Like, you trust people even when you see red flags, you give them chance after chance after chance
Yeah.
because you want to be a good person, because you want to be kind to people. You don't ever want to make anybody feel the way you were made to
Yeah.
feel.
I would
Oh,
even
I should shut up.
I would even argue that there's a lot of high control groups. It's who they make you afraid of. Like in my thing, I was very, and it fit, and why I was attracted to it coming from my trauma background. I was attracted to my faith because it taught me to fear that the world was evil. And there were many people controlled by Satan out to do me harm, out to get me, and that I needed to flock with my, right? I needed the fellowship of my people, and I needed the protective pastoral hierarchy to protect our flock, right? Like that.
Uh-huh.
And it made, and I'm not gonna lie, that made me feel safe because nowhere in my life a lot of people didn't show up for me, especially systemically, in that way. So this made me go, you're right, it is scary. But the danger behind that too is, well, what happens when somebody who's supposed to be in that protective place, who is supposed to be, the one of the people you're trained, you're indoctrinated to trust, isn't trustworthy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what if, when, okay, that, let's say that person didn't harm me, it was somebody else, but I go to them and they don't believe in me, they believe in somebody else, right? There's a lot of areas where when we make such rigid who's good, who's bad, rules, that it makes it difficult. And what I think is interesting, and just to wrap up the neurodivergence thing, is having an understanding of, this is the way the world works, but I am not wrong. And I don't care who you are, but I'm not wrong to be safe, right? However your brain works, I'm not wrong to be safe, and somebody is wrong to make me unsafe. And how do I adapt? No, being myself, how do I adapt to make that as possible as I can be, and that I deserve healing, right? Everybody deserves that healing. So anyway, that's a little
Yeah.
trauma recap. We left in my story with I was a young thing. I was around like middle school age, approaching middle school, I'd say, like elementary and in that. And my abuser, my biological father, would do a lot of manipulative behaviors. Like he would know animals were really important to me and would dangle animals in front of me that I could have them, or he would give them to me and then take them away. They were always reasons about blaming my mother or me supporting my mother and not him. Again, I could never butter up that ego. Like I could never, that was a void that could not be filled. But it was my fault and my responsibility to soothe his broken, and I really do mean the term broken. He was very broken. He couldn't get love and make it stick to him. And he went for every other manipulative, power grabbing way to try to fill that void. And so that power and control for him came out in a lot of abusive people in many different ways, right? From his intimate partner relationships to his children, his friendships, his business relationships, all over the board. So I think I talked a little briefly about this, but it's interesting because my mom told me that when she had first met my father, he very much was like proud that he was an atheist. And I've never known him to identify as that. And I don't know where that came from, where that pivoted. It wasn't his upbringing. It wasn't any of my family's upbringing. I think folks who come from trauma can relate to this, but every once in a while, I'll like look up people in my family just to know where they're at. Like, I want to know where they're at. I feel safer knowing where they're at. And I sometimes, when somebody who has hurt me, who is not on this earth anymore, I feel a sense of calm and safety. And I'm not saying that I devalue someone's human life. I'm saying they were really harmful and unsafe to me. And my nervous system is a little calmer knowing that they can't come at me. So it's a trauma response to want to know where one's harmers are at, right? Where one's abusers are at. Like, I want to know where you're at. I want to see where you're coming, like when you're coming, right? Like, for example, if I found out someone like moved to the same town, I'd be like, oh my God, right? Like, I'd want to know that information, right? Because, as much as we want to say Megan's Law and stuff are all great, do you know how many people are not on such lists who have done things to other people? Right. So this is sort of my way of like checking. And anyway, my point being is when I look up a lot of my relatives now, these folks are quite fundamental in their evangelical beliefs. Things like believing that the earth is flat.
I'm sorry, what?
Yes.
This is
like next level conspiracy. I have first cousins who believe that the earth is flat, and they will use all and
oh my word.
It's funny. I promised myself I would bring this up at some point, so maybe this is now as good a time as any. But I've been paying attention a lot how we're talking about the way the Bible and religion is being talked about in national conversations, right? And I get it. There's a lot of very offended Christians who feel like, excuse me, when you're using your religion, my religion, to say this, let me tell you who Jesus is. I get that. I do. As a former Christian, I get a little bit concerned when we're trying to get in a Bible to Bible like shakeup, or we're trying to out Bible each other or argue about who Jesus really was, because the point is we're using a religious framework for trying to people. And every time we use something, a way of thinking to say, figure out to do what's right, anybody can interpret and have over time and history and culture interpret that in many, many ways. I think we need to look at hey, what is right? And I think in a lot of very simple ways, right is not hurting each other and letting you decide what you're going to do with your own self. And so when we say, well, Jesus says it this way, no, he said it this way, and that's the only way we can see something, I think that's problematic. Because if I introduced, and this happens a lot, and I can speak to this in evangelical communities, if I brought up, oh, but in Islam, this is the way it is, they get really upset that you would use, and we can, there's lots of reasons why we could probably go into why they're upset, but we'll just say, if you use the context of somebody else's religion, they get very, very upset, right? So I'm saying, as a non-Christian, and I used to really bite my tongue and never say anything because I never wanted to offend anybody. But what I'm realizing is, hey, you know what? And because we give evangelical Christianity a huge pass in this country because it's a dominant part of culture. And so we say, well, that's a mainstream thing. It can't be harmful, right? And I'm saying, no, my experience is my experience. I've seen it be harmful. And if you're allowed to say, this is why we should behave because of Jesus, I think I'm allowed to say, we should behave because we should behave. And you can do whatever you want with the way you see Jesus. That's fine. I will not bust up your faith. You get to keep whatever you want to keep. But the way we all treat each other needs to be rooted in our humanity. And if you want to see humanity through your faith, that is fine. But you can't put that on all of us. Otherwise, we're in danger of messing each other up too much. And so my family, when I look at all these people and where they are, it's a lot about this is the way. It's a lot of rigid dogma. And it's a lot about, I cannot be even convinced that the earth is round, right?
Well,
that's
because
intense.
because when you start talking about groups like that, for them to survive, they have to create an us versus them mentality,
Right.
where even if they're interacting with more dominant culture, mainstream folks, they always have that moral superiority that enables them to constantly feed their confirmation bias. And they do this by design. This is all by design. It's intentional.
Yes. So when we get back to thinking about my father as being very controlling and abusive in his relationships, one of the ways he would do that is sort of through religion. And it really much was priming me in a way to accept what was normal, right? What is truth, how to see things, right? And so and normalizing that God and Jesus, it comes from this place. This is fact. This is history. This is, like I didn't know how to question anything. It just was. And what was interesting, we talked about kind of in my last few interviews, is I very much had this like night and day sort of growing up experience, right? Where I would see things through my mom. And my mom came very much from a place of poverty and abuse and similar situation to my father, except the difference is my mother stepped away and my mother started educating herself and taking care of it. And she didn't want to partake in abuse anymore, right? And so there's this huge culture war in my growing up that I'm experiencing, where I'm living in Southern California. I'm living in the Los Angeles area most of my life, where I'm exposed to richness of people from all over the globe, right? People from lots of backgrounds, ways of thinking, languages, food. And I'm experiencing not just in a distant observation sort of way. I think there's a difference when humans can see people, and there's a difference when you can interact. Like, and when you go to somebody's house and you eat their food and you meet their family and you talk to them and you rely on them for something. Like, I had school and friendships with lots of people that at the same time my father was like telling me are like, bound for damnation, right? And I'm going, these
I,
people are
I
so
was
nice.
I was going to ask if you felt like they were the Antichrist or they were going straight to hell. They were on that slippery slope.
You know what this experience taught me, and if you have indoctrination of any kind, I don't mean just religion, but indoctrination is you have to do a lot of cognitive dissonance, which I call mental gymnastics, where you're like, to make it work this thought over here, you kind of also have to way stretch over here, and like, it doesn't actually like your body
Well,
shouldn't
and
bend
not
that
only
way.
that, the group often teaches you to engage in thought stopping cliches,
Right.
to invoke cognitive dissonance so you can remain confident in your moral superiority
Mm-hmm.
while
I remember,
maintaining that divide between anybody external to the group.
yeah, and it was interesting because at this time in my story, my mom had gone to college and graduated, and my mom started law school. And in law school, as a lawyer, you are trained to deconstruct and question anything. Sometimes the danger with that, by the way, is you can shape that in a way to your own narrative. It doesn't necessarily always mean you're truth seeking, right? When you see people make laws or argue in front of the court today and they're doing really well, or they're trying to convince you of a thing, keep in mind that it may be about the argument and the presentation of that argument, not necessarily of fact, right? Um, but you are taught to critically think, right? And so it's kind of like there's some seriously powerful skills there, and it's sort of like, is that person going to be a Jedi, or is that person going to the dark side, right? Like, you can do a lot with that power and it could go either direction, right? But my mom used to really have these conversations with us that were very critically thinking. And so I would be like, yeah, let's think about that. And when I would ever have a question, so, fast forwarding to high school, like, I would really put my pastors through the ringer in some ways about social issues and things that I was brought up with my mom at the time in high school. And I'll get to that. I'm sorry, I fast forwarded, but when I didn't have my father in my life anymore, I was a lot more comfortable than I was to say that certain equality issues were really important to me. Even though I was closeted my whole youth upbringing, I still cared about other people. I had friends who were queer and I didn't like them being treated badly. And so I would bring these questions to my preacher, and I would go to the progressive, on paper, we support this, that church, right? And there are good people doing the religion. However, I was still very much primed from my experience with my father to do cognitive dissonance. So when I would have questions about faith and like, well, why does this make sense? Or why would God allow this or whatever? The answer when it got too tough, or I don't know, is God has a plan and you just don't see it. You don't understand it. Either I was too dumb,
I'm sorry.
not seeing it. I'm so tired of there. I got to a point where I was like, I can't read Job anymore. I have nothing left. Job has nothing left to teach me. And when I got to those places, the answer was either I don't see it, I don't get it, or I'm not meant to see it.
Oh,
I'm not allowed to have any more answers. And I think that's interesting when you get to a place, especially with humanity, where we say you're not allowed to have any more answers, any more seeking. And I think by nature, humans are seeking. And so that's an interesting right? And guess what? If we make that direct correlation line to the abuse that I received as a child, and the messaging I got with my father is, how dare you ask the they talk about it in the order, and it's a Mormon fundamentalist religious group, where it's the one above you. And I know a lot of religions operate that way. It's like your father, your pastor, whoever, your bishop, right? Whoever's above you, right? How dare I'm not meant to know, right? Or why would you question God, right? Or you'll find out when you're dead. And I go, well, I gotta wait for a while then. Damn. Like,
Well, I mean, I actually wrote about that in my first book because,
yeah,
I went to my stepfather because that was the person in authority
because you were
over me.
spirited.
I was a little spirited, a little, but that's like, those are overlapping ideologies that often exist despite whatever flavor, like
Yeah.
whatever flavor of group it is. If it is a toxic group, and if it is perpetuating ideology that is harmful, then often they just engage in that. Oh, Crystal says hi. Hi, Crystal. Nice to see you here. I'm glad we're continuing this conversation because I think it's really important to have this kind of conversation
Mm-hmm.
and to come at it from a perspective where we can talk about the reality of what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I
But
want to really clarify again to your belief system and who made you, who gave you life, how you're going to be in the world isn't under an attack. Um, the reality I would hope humans can see is that they aren't the only ones who have a strong belief. So that was the other juxtaposition. My father very much had me believing that the way we feel about our way of life, sometimes he called it, I don't know, he was a weirdo, but it was like I was like, you're using like I don't know. It sounded very like, and again, I talked about his like weird love of the Confederacy, right? But it was like our way of life, right? But it was like our whiteness, our religion, our place in world leadership, right? We were very much taught that it was like um, that we were the ones who got it. And what's interesting is how many groups, particularly high demand groups on earth, believe that very same thing. And what was interesting is when, again, being having this juxtaposition while I'm growing up, I would see other people and I would sit in their synagogue and sit in their church, and I'm like, they think the same thing. And I will say, not all of them believed that they knew they were 100% right and there was no other possible way. There were many times I sat in a group where they said, this is what we believe, but we're totally fine understanding that there's no way to know 100%, and maybe something else works for somebody else, and live and let be, like,
Mhm.
wow, that's interesting. But um my early brain was really taught and shaped to say our way of thinking is normal and everybody else has not quite got it. So then I
there's not a
come yeah, yeah,
there's not a I have a really sarcastic remark about this.
go.
That's not one way to create a person who truly, genuinely believes in their own holy moral superiority, isn't it? Not at all.
No,
They would never do that by
never.
design,
No, no,
intentionally, on purpose.
no.
Almost. It almost
Right?
feels that way,
It
but
it looks like a recipe that was intentional and balanced and planned, but you don't know what you're talking about. No, no.
well, of course not, because I wasn't born with an extra appendage. Let's not forget
Right,
that portion.
right. Yeah, that's where all the brain power is.
I
Anyway,
know, right?
I
Clearly.
Anyway,
Clearly.
I want to share a brief story that kind of is the pivot point, if you will, in my story where my father gets to exit my life. And so it's interesting. Since we last talked, I started writing a book. And Mary's a cool inspiration for that too. Mary's reads are awesome. I can't wait for the second one. But so
Oh my.
I was like, I've had, and I said I'd create some content at some point about trauma, injury, and healing. But I've had some interesting biological trauma injury treatment that has been life changing. I feel like a different human. It's been amazing, and I can talk more about that at some point. However, in this book, I've been writing about my experience living with trauma my whole life and kind of since then, and sort of this, again, juxtaposition, right? What is this experience like? And I write about this incident in my book, so there'll be a lot more details there whenever it gets to be a book. But this story was quite interesting. And when I say I was kidnapped, it was, I didn't even know that was what was happening at first. So if you'll recall, or maybe you don't know, I'll just give a little context. While it doesn't make sense logically that my father was given some custody of us, that we were allowed to visit unsupervised and all of that, that was actually court ordered by the judge.
I
And at
remember.
one point early in my childhood, my sister and I were actually wards of the court. It was decided that I don't know, all this abuse is so crazy and we can't suss out who's safe or what's going on. So we'll let the court be in charge of them. Long story short, through some court battles and a lot of misogyny, it was very different in the 90s. There's also about blaming mothers, although this still happens today. But this was like, in law school, a lot of times you learn about court case history and you build what is to come based off of case history. And so like the 90s are a huge like moment, if you will, for what's called parental alienation syndrome. And this is also why I get on a soapbox about how mental health can be very harmful. It's power. It is power given. It is power over people. You need to be careful with that. And you need to look at power dynamics, right? So just as religion can be dogmatic and problematic and abusive, so can health, right? So can mental health. And so I think that's really important, to empower the person in front of me, not me over them. Anywho, there was
Couldn't agree more.
I can't remember this quack's credentials. I want to say he was I could look it up. My mom actually wrote a whole law review article on this. I think I talked about it in a previous interview. But basically, parental alienation syndrome came from this dude who I believe was a psychologist, maybe psychiatrist. But basically, we come up with these terms to describe something. So he came up with this, and it was basically saying that moms, parents, but it usually was used against moms, are putting abuse stories into their children's heads to keep them from their fathers. So you get the idea why it's called parental alienation. So a lot of judges at this time and a lot of lawyers were citing this dude. He would actually go into court and testify about this. And so a lot of times in actual abuse cases, people are not getting access to their kids, or kids are becoming accessible to their abusers, right? Because, oh, this expert has said this is what's happening, right? The other thing too is culturally, and I think this is true a lot and it was in my upbringing, evangelical kind of kids are not to be heard or not to be seen. Like there's you
Kids are
under,
supposed to be
right.
Kids are supposed to be seen but not heard.
Yeah. But the other thing too is like kids are pure and the whole like follow, the children will lead the way to God and all of that. And it was supposed to be because we were I remember being taught once in Sunday school about Jesus as the shepherd and all of us children are supposed to follow. And I look at that back on that now and I go, I was a sheep. You called me a sheep.
You
So
told
many
me to
times
be a sheep.
you taught me to be a sheep. And I said so many times, like, the shepherd analogy gets used, but if a sheep strays from the herd, doesn't follow, something happens to them, it gets eaten by a wolf, right? So guess what? If something happens to you, a wolf got you, you weren't following Jesus. Something you did, right? And I started at one point when I'm doing my questioning is going, wait a minute, I'm feeling like maybe I didn't have a shepherd that protected me. I think I was out there on my own, right? Or if I was, there's somebody who's not obviously very engaged because I got picked off and I was pretty sure I was doing what I was supposed to do. And also, so what if I screwed up? I'm deserving of a wolf? Like,
You were a child.
yeah, I was a little kid.
let's be so for real right now. Children, one, cannot consent.
No.
2, they are children. And let me make that very, very clear. Part of what you need to know and what you need to understand. You need to understand that literally, legitimately, I am having conversations with my teenager right now talking about, yes, you've grown. Yes, you know a lot of things. Yes, you've learned all of this stuff, but your brain development is still incomplete until your mid-20s.
Yes. I'm glad you bring this up too, because when we were talking about brains and biology and all of this too, I listened to a really good talk once who was talking about teenagers specifically and saying, there's a lot of like, oh, it's hormones making the teenagers be teenagers, right? And he said, no, it's brain development. This part of your brain that does slow down. It is the brake pedal. It is the slow it down. It is the empathy where it's not about me all the time. And that includes, I don't mean just compassion, but I mean, oh my God, everybody's looking at me. Everybody thinks it's about me. Everybody's judging me. And everybody in the classroom, by the way, is doing the same thing because they're all in that age developmental stage. This is a thing. We know this isn't an opinion. We know.
No, this is facts.
Brains are
This is facts.
The earth is round and brains are not developed fully until their mid-20s.
It's a fact, okay? Yeah. Fact. It's not my feeling. It's not my thoughts. This is not megadanga, okay? It's a fact.
Yeah.
That until our mid-20s, I believe it's at least like from age 24 to 27 or something like that. I could be off on the years a little bit, but it is mid-20s.
Ask a different person, you're going to get in that, and you're going to get in that range.
Right. Yeah. So I just like to say mid-20s because it has been proven over and over again that every human being's brain development is incomplete until at least mid-20s. So it is, I don't even know how to explain it to me that we sit here and we expect children to conduct themselves and to have the thought processes available to them without being taught them and without like having their brains fully developed. Like, can we be more realistic and maybe just a little kinder to our children? Just maybe.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Mary. Okay, where was I with this? Oh. Okay. So I'm in middle school. I'm trying to remember. I want to say maybe end of 6th grade, 7th grade, somewhere in this range. Again, this is what trauma does to one's memory. Right? Those exact dates are hard to pin down. By the way, it is look upable, right? Like I can actually go through the court documents and find, but anyway, so I know I'm accurate within months, okay? Um and in fact, I want to say it probably was the end of 6th grade, because I remember 7th grade being a year I took a deep breath for the first time in a long time. So it was, I told you, courts let my father have visitation, unsupervised visitation. That's where that led. He picked us up from school on a Friday, me and my sister, and said, hey, surprise, we're going on a little trip. And because we're going to so and so, it was a family friend, this little girl, my sister and I's age. It was her birthday. By the way, to this day, I get very concerned when I think about family friends and other people's children, because I knew he was unsafe and I don't know what everybody went through. So I always think, gosh, if anybody's ever watching or wanted, they don't need to connect with me, but are you back?
Yes. Oops.
But I always think, gosh, if somebody was ever watching or something, I mean, no expectation that they would need to reach out. But I know abusers don't just abuse one person or a few people, or they did it once and stopped. That is not the pattern, right? That has been studied and understood, right? Because it's about control and filling a need and a void that is sick and unfillable. And he wasn't ever getting treatment for anything, right? And I would argue that when there's that level of pathology, you can't fix it. It's like if somebody had a cancer in their body that was inoperable and you can't do anything, right? This is that level of pathology. But anyway, so I know that abusers don't do that one and done stuff, or just you. A lot of times victims believe that they're the only ones, and a lot of times it keeps them from speaking out because they or in my case, and I know many cases, they think it's not happening to my siblings, and if I just let it happen to me, then nothing will happen to my siblings. And that's not the case. And oftentimes the abusers keep people in silence, and they keep them apart so that they don't talk to each other and know, actually, it's happening to you too. Because a lot of times what happens is we have that shame so ingrained in our body and our psyche that we think, I deserve this, or it's bad, it's whatever. But when we see it happening to somebody else is when we go, oh no, right? I can't abide by this, or I need to protect them. And there were so many times in my childhood where I felt myself trying to be in a protective stance for my younger sister. I didn't want anything to happen to her. And I won't speak to her story at all, but I can tell you abusers don't just one and done with one victim and it never happens again, or it isn't happening all over the place. Again, that is a pathologically unsatisfiable need for control. It's happening multiple places everywhere. So again, I don't know, some of my friends, our family friends, I worry for them. I still carry that worry. But we go to this little girl's birthday party, but we go to a hotel. And I being, I don't know where I'm in my head. I'm being a little kid. I'm excited to be in a hotel. I think hotels are fun. I mean, my kids to this day think hotels are the best. They don't even care about what we're doing. They're just like, we're in a hotel, right? So I have that kind of little kid energy where I'm like, we're in a hotel. I'm excited. And I'm all about it. And the thing also, it's kind of messed up because as a parent, I would never let my kids do this now. So it freaks me out. I know I wasn't being parented properly, but in this case, my sister and I were often safer not being parented. Like if he wasn't around, we were safer. And that should be a huge red flag. But he used to give us, you're muted, Mary.
Oh, should be.
Yeah.
Should be is the
Right.
critical word right there. Should be a huge red flag. If you are safer when you're not being parented.
I was walking around like there's just a flag hanging off my head, like my whole childhood. It's like, oh, fine, it's not happening. But anyway, he would
Everything's
let
good.
us have so much freedom when we would get to a hotel. He would be like, here's your key. We're little girls, right? I think it was 11, 12, maybe. And my sister is 9-ish, and he'd go, here's a hotel key. And this is in Los Angeles, so I mean, I'm not some small town, whatever, but bad shit happens everywhere. Excuse my French, but like, anyway, he'd go, here's a key. See ya. He also would be like, go put your bathing suits on. You can go take yourselves to the pool. There's no lifeguard, nothing. Like, we'd go swim by ourselves. But
No
anyway,
red flags. Okay.
so he'd be like, have fun. But my sister and I loved it because we got to do our own thing. Like, and I mean, we did that too. Growing up, I had a friend that we used to go when we lived in Oxnard, which is like very much an ocean beach community. And the houses we had, our backyard was literally like a patio and a dock to the ocean. And it's like sort of a suburban community. When you see streets and there's like all the garages are facing and people pull in, imagine that on the street side, but on the other side is the ocean side of that. And so there's literally docks with boats in their backyards. So I lived a lot there with growing up, and we had another friend. I'll get to that in a minute because that informs my queerness quite a bit. But we had a lot of freedom. He'd be like, go on your bike, go ride. We used to go ride to her dad's country club and like swim by ourselves and go to the locker room and get dressed and like, you know, order food and bike around town and come back and whatever. And my mom would be like, you did what? But she had no power. She wasn't allowed to say or whatever. So anyway, we get to this hotel. I'm so excited because I'm like, see ya, we're gonna go do fun stuff and feel a little better, not with you. And we go to this friend's party. Now my sister now points out to me, she goes, Kristen, do you think mom knows where we are? And all of this, so I look at her at first and I go, what do you think is weird? Like, no, we go to this person's, like, this is our friend. We like legit did go to the birthday party, right? So I was like, what do you think is fishy? And she goes, no. She goes, but they don't live that far from us, right? We go to their house for parties and play dates before. We never stay in a hotel right next door. Why would we stay in a hotel? And then I said, all of a sudden, like, and trauma does physical symptoms all the time. I felt like my stomach just drop. And I just went, oh, like my body knew I was unsafe, like instantly, like it was not good. And I went, oh. And then she goes, do you hear that? We're right next to the airport. All constantly, and also because there was this big skylight thing over. If anybody stayed in Embassy Suites, it's like a chain of hotels, right? Where it basically is designed where like all the room, like there's a huge courtyard in the middle, and there's oftentimes like big glass skylights, and so like you could see and hear planes constantly going over, and every time a plane went over, I'm going. So I am having what I now know to be tons of trauma, physical, you know, like activation happening, right? Where my stomach is just in knots. I am hyper vigilant. I am like checking constantly. I am sweaty. I'm not okay. And now I'm also feeling, it's interesting because I was the one that was like, yeah, we fine. And my sister was the one who points out to me, I don't think we're fine. And then suddenly, once she pointed that out, I suddenly became in the protective like role. It was my job to start stepping up. So my sister, a lot of times, and again, I'm trying to speak to her story, but more to inform the context of what I was feeling and what I was doing in that situation. My sister became very, very scared. And she became very shut down. And I really want to point out too that I get rather upset when people talk about trauma symptoms, in particular survivors, where I was watching, it was a creepy show about like serial killers and like people who do big scary crimes, and they were talking about a serial artist who would assault women and then graduated to assaulting and unaliving them, right? And so I am watching how they would talk about, like, the police investigators and people are talking about these women, and the women who fight, well, she was a fighter, right? And the women who said, oh my gosh, I better not move, or I couldn't move, or and like the way we talk about this is important, right? Because there shouldn't be any shaming to what your brain is doing that is outside of your control in this situation, because it is okay, however, especially as a child, right, your brain reacted to when you were unsafe. So and I gotta tell you that even if you were the fighter in the scenario, it has consequences later. And I didn't always feel like I was strong or a fighter always, right? It had consequences. And there was nothing wrong with my sister who felt her age and her safety. And, so however we need to survive that is okay. We shouldn't have had to survive that. So anyway, my sister all of a sudden goes, oh my gosh, she sees it too. When it became real to both of us and I agreed with her, it was very real for both of us. Now I want to give a little context of why we knew this was scary too. We have an older sister. I talked about her before through my father's previous marriage. And she had been kidnapped by our father. I can't remember the exact length of time, but he took her without permission and did unspeakable tortures to her mind and body in all manners. Drugged her, kept her in a room, wouldn't let her have access to mom. Her mother didn't know where she was. She escaped by finding a phone and got out. I would again like to point out, this was not unknown, right? This is the system that gave me and my sister to the man who did that. And my sister and I were aware that he had done that. We were aware of the abuse we were currently being put through, or at least I was aware mostly of my own abuse, not as much as my sister's, I should say. So I very much knew he's capable of bad things and I could be disappeared. My mom also, as a matter of protection, had tried to tell us, here is what the court says. Now, she wasn't allowed to badmouth him in any respect, and she didn't. But as a safety planning, and we do this in mental health all the time as therapists, like teaching kids, and unfortunately, when kids have unsafe backgrounds or an unsafe parent or whatever, like you're teaching them safety skills. And it is a very unfortunate reality that I have to teach children safety skills because adults can't act safely for children. And I need that to change in the world, right? And this is why I speak about it. But one of the safety things my mom had taught and talked to us about is, here is what the court says. Neither myself or your father can take you on any sort of trip without the other knowing, right? He's supposed to say, this is my plan for this weekend. While it may be his weekend, if you're not staying in his house, I'm supposed to know and have permission. So one of the things my sister had said to me is, do you think mom knows? And I said, oh, well, yeah, well, I'm trying to think that through. Does she know? And my mom said, or my sister said, a lot of times and we asked, so we decided to like test our father. We were trying to be careful in how we test that out. And we said, oh, this is very fun, Daddy. And Daddy, does Mom know where we are? And he goes, of course, but this is a surprise. She's not going to tell you. And he lied and manipulated a lot, but this did not feel right. Didn't sit right. And so we said, okay, this can't be right. So my sister starts to kind of shut down a little bit and is like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And I said, well, we got to get to the bottom of, does she know? If she knows, all right, we're probably okay. If not, she definitely needs to know. We're not okay. And so either way, we need to go talk to her. Now, there's no way, especially if he was planning something sinister, and we said, can we call Mom? That's going to go over well. We're smart enough to know that, right? It's interesting because sometimes kids, when you go, well, why didn't they ask this, or why didn't they do this, right? Sometimes kids know how to survive. They're letting a little bit of that instinct come in, and they can figure something out. It's interesting when you see that working. So we go, well, this is in the 90s, so this is a days of payphones. And for y'all who don't know what a payphone is, it is a phone attached to a wall that has cords, and used to put change into it. And then you could also have things called a calling card, right, where you would call somebody. You could also do a thing that was calling collect, where the charge would be given to somebody else or whatever. Anyway, the first time we called, I think we scrounged some change, but it wasn't enough for a long conversation. A phone will hang up, right, if you don't have enough money. But anyway, we call my mom. And of course, I can hear the horror and the panic in my mother's voice. She's like, where are you? No, you are not supposed to be anywhere else. Do you know where you are? Where are you? Okay, can you keep calling me back? All of that. And of course, my sister and I explode into tears. My sister basically unravels in front of me. I'm sad and upset, but then I'm also feeling and I don't put this on my mom, but my mom, I think, had an understanding that when we went in those unsafe spaces, we were all each other had. So she would try to tell me about how to look after her, right, and stuff. So I took that upon myself a lot. And so I'm trying to prop her up, keep her together. I end up getting on the phone with an operator because now I'm out of money, right? I don't have money. I'm a child. And so I get on the phone with the operator and I said, operator, my mom doesn't know where I am. I'm not supposed to be in places where my father doesn't have permission. He took us and I need to call my mom. And she goes, okay, hold on, don't hang up. And she's clearly probably talking to a supervisor or something, because that's a lot for an operator to handle. And then she comes back on. She goes, do you need the police? Now, y'all, when she says this, my little eyes bug out because I know it's an emergency in here in my gut. I know it. I feel it. But I also didn't really cognitively, this part of my brain isn't on, right? I didn't cognitively think, gosh, you are in danger. And so when she said that, it like snapped for me that I'm in danger. When people call the police, a crime is happening. Is this a crime? And I go, no, mostly because I'm like, I'm going to be in so much trouble. And so again, when you wonder why kids don't get the authorities involved, right? Because I go, oh my God, no authority in my life had ever protected me, right? So they call the police to come storming in here. What do you think is going to happen to me? I have no faith in that. So I'm like, okay, one, it is a crime. It is an emergency. That went off for me, but I can't depend on that. And so I go, no, just please connect me to my mother. So the phone, she connects the phone. My mom ends up and connecting with her lawyer too, who's asking me various questions. My mom is talking to both of us. And at this point, I'm at least glad my mom is around now on the phone because she can kind of talk to my sister who's really upset, and she talks to me. And my mom's, I just remember saying a lot of the right words to empower me in that situation and tell me that you keep surviving, you stay with other people. I will not let anything happen to you. And I think I told you I was preparing for these interviews. Like I had some conversations with my mom to kind of refresh my memory. And she was telling me about how she goes, yeah, you were asking for, it was my adopted dad's, he adopted me later after my father had left, but brother to come, like, can he covertly come? He doesn't know what my father doesn't know what this guy looks like. Can he come covertly come sit in the lobby and just like, we wanted people to have eyes on us, but we didn't want them to like come wearing badges and get us in trouble. Right. So we wanted safe adults, but we didn't want to get in trouble. So we were asking for something. Now, at the time, we didn't know that adults were doing things for us and our protection. I since learned that my mom told me that the whole hotel staff was aware of the situation and they had security doing sweeps by our room all through the night, making sure nothing.
I'm sorry.
They were making sure nothing was happening to us. I didn't know, like, when I learned about that later, I was like, oh, somebody gave a fuck and they didn't even see my age. They didn't even know who I was. And that didn't happen to me before. So there were people watching me. They spoke with lawyers and investigators giving them, hey, he checked in under a fake name. Something bad was going to happen. He checked in under a fake name. He paid all in cash. And like, so we had, if I remember correctly, we had like a driver too. We didn't even like have a car. I can't remember. It was very like something bad was happening. And so, anyway, we had several, conversations over the phone because we were there a couple of days. Basically, my father would let us, again, we had that hotel key. He would say, go down, get yourself, because they would have breakfast buffet or whatever in the hotel. You can go get your own breakfast. And the benefits of having an alcoholic father sleeping one off in the morning every morning was that, like, we would go, all right, we're getting up as soon as like the breakfast is getting set up, right? Because we would get on the phone to my mom. So we, and it was funny because I've never been happy to be an early riser unless I'm going to Disneyland or I got to survive something. And so I was like, get up, and I'm waking my sister up, like, we gotta go. And we were like, we never got ready so fast in our lives. We would get down there, call my mom first thing. She'd be waiting for our call. Anyway, what ended up happening, and there are parts of this story that I wasn't aware of at the time. Like I said, it wasn't what we were told. And again, I don't blame anybody for what they did or did not tell us. They were doing the best they could with trying to figure out what did we need to know that wouldn't like cause us, it was a very dangerous situation, and like wouldn't cause us to react in a way that would put us in more harm or anything. Um, so many lawyers were brought in, so many investigators, so many, like, I can't tell you all the people involved trying to figure out what was the safest thing to talk him down. And one very smart person said, we got to call his lawyer. So his lawyer is the one who's going to know what a cluster F he has gotten himself into, and he's going to talk him out of that. And so my mom's lawyer called his lawyer and said, are you aware of this? This is what is happening. There were no paperwork filed. This is not what's supposed to happen. We've called the hotel. We know he's checked under a fake name. He's paid cat. Like, here are all the things, right? And his lawyer genuinely was shocked and went, oh my God, and knew legally, because you know as a lawyer, right, what a pickle your client has put themselves in, right? So he calls him and is like, what are you doing? Return them now. And he goes, everybody knows where I'm at. What's going on, right? And they said, yes, for your own legal thing that you're walking yourself into, leave it. Like, don't say anything to the girl. Like, don't do nothing. Put them in the car now. Return them to the mother. We can sort this out after. So he looks all kinds of like, it's bottled rage. And I'm like, it's like dynamite that's like, oh, handle that with care. I don't know when that's going off. And my sister and I are like literally clinging to each other. Like, and he goes, I have to return you to your mom, because did you call them? And why would you call your mother? Would you not trust me? And we're getting this sort of lecture, and then we're like crying, but also we know, also, like, if you grow up in Los Angeles, you start kind of knowing, like, oh, good, we're on the correct freeway to go. Like, we are on the correct freeway to go. We are going back to West Los Angeles, thank God. Like, we're going the right way. I see my mom's house, and it was like, like, symptoms after that. We stayed in my mom's bed for a while. Like, it hurt to breathe. I couldn't eat. I felt sick. I didn't want to go outside. I was scared to go back to school. I was absolutely terrified. And for a while, my mom did the first things of just trying to like calm our nervous system, I think. And just, her babies were hurt, and she was terrified too. So all three of us just like needed each other, and just to kind of say, oh my gosh, I didn't lose you. That's the feeling. And then she turned it to, baby, and she kind of said this before to us, but, and again, this isn't parental alienation syndrome. This is my mom saying to us, you are a little older now. You had an experience, and you also have a voice and choices. And I'm sorry that a lot of adults and people have not listened to you when they should, but you still have that voice. And there are people who are listening, and we have a new judge now. So huge, huge change in my story was a new judge. We got a new judge who started making some changes where he would be like, what? Why is that happening? And my mom said, you can communicate to the judge if you need to communicate to the judge. So my sister and I wrote a letter to the judge about that experience and about some, and I stress, some of the things that were going on. I did not disclose any CSA, but I talked about his drinking and driving under the influence with us in the car. I talked about his smoking in front of me while I have asthma and I can't breathe. I was talking to them about the things he would say about my mom and about making me take medicines that I didn't need. um all of the sudden, and this is a very fuzzy time, y'all, for me, because my world literally blew up in so many ways, and not necessarily all in bad ways, but it was a lot, right? And it was a lot for me to process. But basically, in my mind, the way I was experiencing it and remembering, all of the sudden, we were supposed to have, it's his weekend, but we don't see him, and we don't see him, and time is going by and we don't see him. What I'm feeling like is abandoned. And I, every time I use that word, I think that gets confusing for folks because they go, well, good riddance, he's a piece of crap, right? um, why would you feel abandoned by somebody who's hurting you? Well, the reality is, this was my father who I felt like just ghosted me and didn't want me. Um, Now, I talked about this in another interview about how kids can be extremely to their detriment forgiving of a particularly parental abuse, because you just so want the love, unconditional positive regard from your parent. That is normal. And so when he left in that way, I was like, I'm not, he doesn't want me. And I felt sad. But then I just started to feel really good and safer and better. Now, I'm gonna really like condense this part of like middle school, but I had a hard time behaviorally in middle school. In sixth grade, I dabbled with being a bully. um, to my ever loving shame, I was not nice. We particularly bullied this one girl, and a lot of times now when you see bullying and stuff, we should absolutely believe the kids being bullied. I was also bullied in elementary school and I didn't have any support. So you need to support that. But a lot of times, look at a child who's being a bully, because there are flags there too. Something is going wrong, right? And in my power life situation, I didn't feel like I had control and power over my life. And instead of being made fun of for the wackadoo things that were going on in my world and the way I presented to my classmates, I used to get bullied for the way that I talk. I'm aware. I used to be a lot. I used to have a lot more of like a twang in my voice, from people who raised me who are not from California. And um, anyway, I get bullied for that. I would be bullied for like things my father would say or do. Anyway, and so I became a bully instead of being bullied, if that makes sense. And so when my father had left, I suddenly found a new sense of safety, and peace. And there was a lot of grief and sad and feeling less than too. But then I also found some peace. And I said, okay, I started having quality friendships based off of character. And it meant I wasn't the popular kid anymore because I wasn't getting popular by bullying. Right? It was like really like mean girls stuff happening. It was not good. And so a lot of positive things changed for me. One of the other things that I started um, wanting in my life or trying to understand was my religious thing. So when you're 13 in Judaism, you have a bar bat mitzvah. It's becoming a woman or man culturally. You go through a lot of classes at the synagogue, and you go up in front of temple and everybody, and you read from the Torah. I'm apologizing if I am like leaving out anything that is important or sacred, like to those who are Jewish. Condensing. And I did not grow up Jewish. I grew up amongst many friends who were. And so, anyway, that informs my story because around this age, I'm going to a lot of bar bat mitzvahs, right? For a lot of friends. And I'm going, I had a best friend that I constantly was at, like, I was at her house, she was at my house, kind of a thing. And so I would constantly be at her house on Friday nights after school because we'd have sleepovers. So that meant I'm having Shabbat dinner with her family all the time. So I'm observing, and then I'd be around. So then they'd be like, okay, you're coming to temple with us if you're staying the weekend, right? So then I would go to her temple with her, right? And then she would have like, it's basically the equivalent of like Sunday school classes. So I would go with her, and it was funny because most of the time nobody knew that I wasn't Jewish. So I got to like, it was like being a fly on the wall, and I got to hear what they said about other religions. And it later on was really informed, like shaping, because I know when I say I see the way others feel about their faith, and um the fact that faith can happen outside of my faith, and that can be a very real experience, right? And that somebody doesn't believe less because they're differently believing, right? So that was really shaping. But anyway, it led to this curiosity where I asked my mom, like, hey, wait a minute. So now that my father's not around and I'm not like having these weird Bible lessons from him that are mostly about listening to fathers and the roles of children and all of that, like, who are we? What are we? What are we doing here? And I remember at the time she was kind of annoyed by this question. And I should say, again, I don't want to speak for my mom's faith journey, and it's changed over the years. But my mom ended up marrying, so my stepfather at the time, they met in law school, and he's another narcissist, but he wasn't like abusive to me. He had other difficult issues. They just manifested them in our relationships differently. And I know that's overly simplistic, but sorry, that's what you're getting right now. And he was a very intense atheist. And so I feel like a lot of our religious stuff that we had done, like in the past, like my mom would dress us up and take us to Easter Sunday, things like that. Like we didn't do that anymore. And I think a big part of that was his influence, his comfort. Like he would literally just call that stuff stupid, and people who believed were stupid. Like he was very disrespectful blatantly. So I asked my mom, like, where do we come from? She goes, well, I like, there were some Lutherans, but mostly we're Baptist. And so and I said, okay, take me to a Baptist church. Cause I'm a kid. I'm like 12 maybe.
Oh my word.
Right? Cause I go, who am I? Who are my people? Everyone around me has people. And it's very important. And if you remember, I was very indoctrinated to be like, you're supposed to be doing this thing. And all of a sudden, like, I would, like, you don't pray with me. How can this be, like, this isn't good for my soul? I was very concerned about my soul. And so she's like, fine, I'll take you to a Baptist church. Now, if anybody who knows the West Los Angeles area, and we were living in Beverly Hills, you can laugh about that if you want. I would like, though, to point out or dispel any rumors. I lived in a small house that was built in like 1930 or so. I'm sure it wasn't cheap, especially cheaper then for sure. But like, I did not live in a mansion or whatever, but there were absolutely some Beverly Hills stereotype things that were true and crazy and outside of this world. One of those things is that if you're looking for a Baptist church in Beverly Hills, there aren't many and they aren't big. And so my mom takes me to this church. Everybody looks so it's like, the Shiny Happy People documentary. I was like, it's kind of like that. Everybody is so happy and hello, and we're all gonna hug and shake. And so I like that, but I'm also a little bit like on guard. So this is trauma symptom. Now that I'm looking back on it, I'm going, I don't know how to feel about this. But then the funny thing, because I remember thinking this as a child, like I'm sitting in, they had pews, and then they had like the, half a, there's probably an architecture term for this, but it's like a balcony above that overlooks, it's like additional seating. And we're
Let
sitting
me
up
just
there.
interrupt you right here,
Okay, do it.
Kristen. Let me clarify something for you. One, we're going to have to begin wrapping things up.
Sure.
Two, we had church. We didn't have churches. We didn't have church houses. We had church
Okay.
in our homes on backless
Yeah.
wooden benches. So, no, I can't picture the pews. Yes, I have visited cathedrals all over the world in different countries. And no, I still I've went to
What
Catholic
is that?
churches. I've went to Baptist churches. I've went to all kinds of churches. I've went to GP one time. Anyways, whatever. I have went to all kinds of different churches, and it's still it's just like this. I'm trying to follow along, and it's really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Culturally, we are not the same, even though
Yep.
we were both born in America.
Totally heard. Totally heard. And in my growing up, like the structures were really important, right? And they contributed to a feeling and a mentality for sure.
Oh.
Uh-huh. And I know of other faiths too where that's really important. Like Mormons will talk about their temple experience, and there's like
I'm
there's a lot.
sorry.
No, but I
You know
seriously,
what?
the physical
You know what we said
space.
about those structures, though?
Hmm.
Well,
I know what my people said about them.
well, what we would have often said about those structures was more or less along the lines of people create houses of worship, but really we're honoring our ancestors by having church in our homes, because during the time of the before the Anabaptists came to America, so my ancestors came in, I believe Jacob Byler came in like 1737 or something like that. We were being persecuted
I was
by the
say came
Catholic Church.
left forced. I mean, it's all yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were being persecuted. So our ancestors were being persecuted. And that is why we have the martyr's mirror. And it is right to honor them, because they used to gather in places. And the Bible does say where two or three shall gather in my name, that is church. So getting together in smaller churches and getting together
Mm-hmm.
in homes is not only honoring our ancestors, but also honoring the suffering for the Lord that our ancestors did. And those worldly churches, we don't even know. We just feel like some of them, it's almost like they have created a false idol. Remember the golden calf?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So, what's funny about that is I had two experiences in high school going on like church outing stuff. One of them was actually it was the same trip, but we went to a couple different places. One is we stopped in San Francisco and um we were walking along, and there we passed by a Catholic church, and it was rather ornate, as many of them are, right? The decoration and sculpture, and I said something about like, the scripture talks about like we're not supposed to idol, false, what like, but and I know they have the same scripture. Is that like how do we, right? We group ourselves feel about that. And my one of my youth leaders said to me, well, are they really Christian? And I went, and I remember thinking,
Oh, there you have it. But that's the no true Scotsman fallacy in
mm-hmm,
action.
mm-hmm,
That is legitimately the no true Scotsman fallacy in action. If I have heard that once, I've heard it a million times.
mm-hmm.
And I'm just tired of having that
And all of
conversation
it, the
about
physical
that.
building or the not, it will make you feel some kind of way, whether it's total absence or the way it is, it makes you feel some kind of way. And when I was
Mm-hmm.
little and I'm sitting in this like rafter thing, I had the ability from that vantage point to kind of like look around, and grew up in Los Angeles my whole life. So till that point. And so I'm looking around and going, oh my gosh, I've never seen so many white people. Like, this is where they all come. Like, in my neighborhood, like, there weren't that many. Or if they were white, they were also Jewish of descent, right? And I'm looking around going, oh, they're here. I'd never seen so many literally congregated. And it kind of was like a little mind-blowing to me.
Uh-huh.
And to me, that was like an interesting segue point to moving to San Diego as a teenager. Because I had that was a huge culture shift. Going from Los Angeles to a little suburb of San Diego, which had a lot of military families, some wealth conservatism. I never knew that there were so many different kind of churches in America. And I didn't know that, like, there were less, I don't know. I didn't know that there were a lot of conservative. I thought that was a minority. And I know that's a weird way to grow up, but especially since I stepped outside of my father's belief structure, like I had freedom from that. I was like, the world around me in Los Angeles was about a lot of different people and ways of thinking that, and it didn't occur to me that like the rest of the world wasn't like that. It was a different sort of naive bubble, if that makes sense. And so when I got to San Diego, and all of a sudden, most of my friends were of a very different mindset, it was very interesting. And I felt othered if I didn't join up, you know? So that was very motivating. And
So you went to San Diego and became a little bit enlightened.
I got more evangelical. I did the whole turn my life to Christ. I accept him as my Lord and Savior. Took all of the lessons. Then I started church shopping because I needed to find something that fit sort of my social ideology, political ideologies that wouldn't make me feel yucky as a human, but also then I could still kind of belong in this community. And I could still, I also had this need, unmet need, to feel safe and have unconditional positive regard. And boy, do missionaries and evangelical folk know how to sell that message, right?
Well,
God
because
loves you. We are all messed up and he doesn't care. And he is your forever father who sees you. Right. And all of those loving messages were great. I since now have different feelings about that, but those were the messages then that were really important to me. We can talk another time about if you're okay. I don't know. I could ramble whenever, but
yeah, I mean, I'm okay. We knew when we started this that
yeah.
we were going to have a series,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Because for you to talk about all of these things, it takes a lot. I just wrote down some notes. Hopefully, I can find these notes when we come back, and hopefully, it doesn't take us like 2 months to come back.
No.
But, anyways, so like San Diego, becoming more evangelical. I wanted to point out that to want to feel a sense of belonging is legitimately, it's in your human nature.
Oh yeah.
You
We need
always
community.
want to feel like you belong somewhere, like you are part of the group. And for a lot of queer and neurodivergent folks, they're often at the fringes of society, and it can be really difficult to feel a sense of belonging because of these rigid structures that try to put us into boxes that we don't fit into. They create these sandboxes and they tell us how to play in them. And the problem is, we were never made for those sandboxes. We were the people who should be able to make the sandboxes. And I wanted to ask you if you had any message for anybody who's listening to this. before we go?
A lot of times when we're reflecting about big stuff, trauma, systems, structures, we're looking a lot about what other people are doing. And I'm not saying that that is wrong, but first start with yourself. Whether you're doing something harmful or harm is being done to you, look to yourself. Look to yourself, right? If you need to step outside of the sandbox or you need to encourage another person to do that, that's okay, right? But we can't do it when we get so focused on what somebody else is doing, right? Notice it, pay attention to it, but know that you got to look at yourself too and take care of yourself, right? Don't be so distracted by somebody else's othering, somebody else's definitions, somebody else's messaging that you can't see your own self. And I think when we see ourselves better, we see other humans better. And so when I know that I don't fit in the sandbox sometimes, I also know that it's okay. Because of that, I know it's okay to encourage somebody if they want to like play outside the sandbox, right? I don't know, I'll play with you. Well, that sounds so funny, but yeah.
Well, I mean, but you deserve to have a sandbox that doesn't make you feel like you want to expire.
Mm-hmm. You set up your own. You set up your own.
Uh-huh. And I think that's amazing. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for commenting. As always, you can like, comment, subscribe, share. And I want to thank our Patreon subscribers for helping us bring you this podcast. Of course, it is produced by the Misfit Amish and our Patreon supporters. Art is used by BJK. And until next time, live your best lives.